Hello and welcome to the National D-Day Memorials Lunchbox Lecture today. My name is John Long. I'm the Director of Education here at the Memorial. My pleasure to introduce our speaker. But before we get to the fascinating talk today, let me invite you officially to our Memorial Day commemoration this Monday, May 30th, 11 o'clock. Our speaker will be a Vietnam veteran, prisoner of war with a great story, Dave Carey. And then again, a week later, June 6th, for our annual commemoration of the anniversary of the landings on D-Day. Our speaker for that one will be World War II historian John McManus. A lot of other things going on. I invite you to check out our webpage, calendar of events for some other things, a couple of concerts, for instance, that week, many other great happenings. So check that out absolutely and join us if you are in the Bedford area. And if you're not in the Bedford area, travel here. It's a great time of year to be in the mountains of Virginia. But we are very pleased today to welcome as our speaker a friend of the Memorial, whom I've known for about 4 or 5 years now since he visited the Memorial, and then we have established an email correspondence back and forth. Bill Beigel is an American military researcher and author who specializes in digging into the records of those who died or went missing in World War II. He's researched more than 1,600 individuals for over 1,000 clients and groups. He has a BA in history and a master's in geography, both from UCLA. And his work has been featured in many venues: USA Today, CBS News, Fox News, Newsday, Daily Breeze, War History Online, et cetera, et cetera. The Air Museum in Duxford, the American Air Museum in Duxford, England, holds a large collection of his research on American flyers. And he is the official researcher for the Kwajalein MIA project. Subject today will be how the heroes came home, built largely on his book that came out in 2019 called Buried on the Battlefield. And this is telling the story that's previously never really been told very fully of how those heroes came home to lie under their native soil. So it's my pleasure to introduce friend of the Memorial, Bill Beigel, who will be joining us now. Bill, thanks.
Right. Thanks so much, John. And thanks everybody at the D-Day Memorial Museum for inviting me to lunch, even though it's still breakfast time here in Redondo Beach. Also, this is a brand new presentation, so I'm going to be using my notes a little more than usual because it is right out of the box, and this is sort of the debut of this project. We're all familiar with many aspects of World War II, and in particular D-Day. But even so, there's always more to be told and more to learn. For instance, when we think about D-Day, we think about the landings on the beaches at Normandy. But what you may not know or recall is that throughout the day, the 8th Air Force dispatched a record 2,587 sorties against targets on the beachhead at Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juno beaches. Their losses for the day were 1 heavy bomber downed by enemy fire, 3 that crashed, and 2 written off by accident. So think about that, 2,500 raids and only a couple planes shot down. To further test your World War II stats and facts, you may also know that the U.S. population in 1940 was about 132 million. And of those, over 16 million served over the course of the war. So 12% of the people living in the United States during World War II were in the military. So everybody had a friend, a relative, a neighbor that was serving. Well, what you may not know is that of the 115 nations that fought in World War II, the United States was the only nation to repatriate our war dead when it was over. We don't really think about it today, But until after World War II, it was not automatic for the overseas military war dead to be brought home. For a number of reasons, including that most countries were so damaged by World War II and their treasuries drained, none of the other nations that fought were able to bring their dead home, which was doubly tragic for all their families. My life's work is locating the military records of men and women, veterans, and casualties of World War II, and telling their stories. Several years ago, I realized that almost no one knows how the United States scoured the world for every locatable American who died in the war and gave the family the choice of where they wanted the loved ones buried, anywhere in the world. Slide 6 tells you a little more about my book, and I'd like to share a short video now that summarizes how I wrote our book.
Among the thousands of books and films recounting the horrors and heroics of World War II, one story has never been told: how the United States was the only nation able to bring home her heroic dead at the end of the war. "16 million Americans answered the call to fight for freedom. 406,000 would have said their last goodbyes. Most were buried thousands of miles from home. They died, but their story wasn't over. The U.S. government decided after the war to spare no expense in locating, identifying, and reburying the dead in any cemetery in the world at their family's direction. But that left each wife, Gold Star parent, or next of kin with an agonizing choice: bring him home or allow him to rest in the soil he fought to liberate, next to the men he fought alongside.
300,000 who died that we might live in security still lie overseas. Their families can now bring them home. But should they?
If people at home could see the care being given at these cemeteries, they would leave most of the dead over here.
To think how he fell, killed instantly, wounded or blown to pieces, among strangers, not a loved one near. I can't believe he is dead. The only way I will ever overcome this awful horror will be to identify his body. If I could find out how he was killed and where he was buried, this awful hurt might ease up a little.
Buried on the Battlefield, Not My Boy, by William L. Beigel, is the first book to explore the return of the dead from World War II. Through historical accounts, gripping images, and emotional personal stories, readers experience the agonizing decisions faced by those who lost loved ones, the painstaking efforts to confirm identities and locate next of kin, and the hero's long journeys home over many thousands of miles.
With you, reason may win. With us, it lost. Our hearts say, bring him home.
Thus will open one of the grimmest pageants ever staged by man: America's War Dead Reburial Project.
All right, hope everyone enjoyed that video. Today, I'd like to tell you stories about some of the men that I've researched. These are 4 of their stories that you'll find in my book, and we're going to start with one of the men that gave his life on D-Day. Edmund Harley was an extraordinary hero and one of the X-Men of D-Day. His remains were not recovered and identified until 4 years after his death. His story shows the difficulties in locating the next of kin at times and the lengths that the Army would take to find them. First, what is an X-Man? As you may know, there is no exact official count of casualties or Allied deaths on D-Day, but the current count is around 2,400, 2,500 who died in Normandy on June 6th. As you can imagine, many of these men went unidentified for a very long time. Due to combat conditions and other reasons, scores of men were buried as unknowns, marking their graves with an X and a unique number assigned to each in the hopes that one day they would be identified. By the summer of 1947, 3 years after D-Day, the man identified as X number 6 was still unknown, although most of the men around him had been identified by then. Due to some factors that I won't describe here, but which you can read about in my book, identifying X6 was particularly difficult. But years after his death, one investigator found a clue in the inseam of his trousers and finally solved the mystery. While you can read more about these X-men in my book, I'd like to make sure that you know the name of X6, Edmund Harley, and at least some of his exemplary actions that day. Tech 5 Harley of Jackson Heights, New York, had been in the Army for 15 months at the time of his death. He was 32 years old, so he was much older than most of the men he served with. He was listing as missing in action until December 1948. A newspaper article in his local town described his heroic actions on D-Day. While on the beach on D-Day, Harley and 5 other men manning a machine gun observed from behind a seawall that enemy artillery had pinned Americans to the beach and were inflicting heavy casualties. The men abandoned their protected positions and carried their gun over the seawall, bringing it to bear on the enemy guns. The diversion allowed the American infantry to advance. Now, Tech 5 Harley was not one of the 3 men killed and 2 men wounded in this exchange, but he was killed later on the beach that day. We don't know exactly where. The American Graves Registration Service, the part of the Army tasked with identifying the war dead, spent months tracking down one relative after another until a living next of kin could be found. And so, once they found that living next of kin, they could carry out the family wishes for Edmund's burial. The X does not obscure the fact that the X-men of Saint Laurent were real men with real families and real lives back home in America. The tireless work undertaken by the Graves Registration Service to identify these men is among the most important stories of repatriation of Americans killed in World War II. Then there's the tragic story of 2 brothers who I really want people to know about and remember. Their names were Guido and J.B. Fast, and their unforgettable mother, Tessie Fast. Before her marriage, Tessie attended Southwestern Oklahoma State University, where she was a member of the Palette and Brush Club. She had just 2 children with her husband, Johnny Fast. According to her letters to the War Department, Tessie and the boys had been abandoned by Johnny, for whom Tessie clearly had no lingering affection, and she raised the boys on her own. Guido Fast, we see pictured here, enlisted in the Marines in 1940 when he was 19 years old, after just 3 months studying civil engineering at the University of Oklahoma. His younger brother, JB, is listed in his high school's honor roll as having joined the war at a time which made it impossible for him to even be included in his senior year of his high school yearbook. Guido shipped out with other members of the 2nd Marine Regiment aboard the USS President Jackson and arrived in the Solomon Islands in August of 1942. By this time, he was promoted to corporal. But on November 14th, 1942, Guido was hit by multiple shell fragments, probably from Japanese artillery or mortar fire, during heavy fighting. He died this day, aged 22 years and 22 days. The following day, he was buried at the 1st Marine Division Cemetery on Guadalcanal and was awarded the Purple Heart. Tessie was notified by telegram of Guido's death about 3 weeks after he died. Like thousands and thousands of other mothers and fathers who lost sons in this war, one of her first reactions was disbelief. But Tessie had the most direct way of expressing herself, and I think this sums up what a lot of families meant but never said. Tessie did not hold back. I received your telegram Monday afternoon, thank you, but really I do not believe it. The only way I will believe it would be to see his body. She continues, I know you people notified the man called Johnny Fast. Guido did not wish this to be done. Guido never forgot the times that Johnny let him go hungry and told him that he and his brother could starve for all he cared. I am the sole guardian of my 2 sons and have been for years. So please leave him out of this, please. It only added to my hurt. I still say Guido is alive. I cannot believe anything else. For nearly a year, Tessie sent numerous letters to the military officials, continuing to express her disbelief that Guido was dead in very, very emotional terms. But no matter what Tessie wrote to the military, each reply from them was factual, sensitive, and respectful. The Army expressed particular regret that they could not provide any details of Guido's death, but that didn't stop Tessie from demanding more answers. In January of 1944, her younger son, JB, was selected to become a pilot in the Army Air Corps. He completed his flight training and was assigned the position of a flight officer and based at a place called Bartow Airfield in Central Florida. 2 months later, during a flight training mission, JB lost his bearings in his P-51 Mustang, and it was under cloudy, maybe stormy conditions. He apparently climbed up through the overcast to figure out where he was. But JB was never heard from again, and the wreckage of his plane was never found. The Air Corps placed blame for the crash squarely on JB. But in my book, I detail how this young pilot should not have been blamed for a number of reasons. Among them, JB was a novice flyer with only 29 and a half hours total flight time and only 2 hours of flight time under instrument conditions on that fateful day. Either way, Tessie had now lost both of her sons. She desperately wanted the bodies back, even writing to the War Department requesting permission to go to Guadalcanal and bring back the body of Guido in person. She even went so far as to write President Truman directly, asking permission to recover the body. But in the end, the military did not allow her to do this. But Guido was finally returned home in line with her wishes. In February 1948, more than 5 years after he was killed in action, he was brought back and laid to rest at Rose Hill Burial Park in Oklahoma City. And if this story isn't tragic enough, when I found Guido's headstone, I discovered that his first name was mistakenly spelled as Guido. There's a lot more to tell about Tessie's story and her search for the site of JB's crash. And in the interest of time today, I can't share all the stories that there are to tell, but please remember Guido and JB and Tessie. Finally, I'd like you to know and remember Japanese-American Ross Fujitani, a husband and father of a 2-year-old son, killed in action in France. I researched Ross for his granddaughter. She came to me because her father, Ross's son, never even knew where Ross was buried. Ross was part of the very well-known, the famous 100th Infantry Battalion, a segregated unit. The 100th was comprised of more than 1,400 American-born Japanese soldiers that were formerly members of the Hawaiian National Guard. Their accomplishment in battle is storied. The battalion was awarded 6 Distinguished Service Crosses. And as a frame of reference, the Distinguished Service Cross is only 1 notch below the Medal of Honor. They got these Distinguished Crosses within the first 8 weeks of combat and also earned 3 Presidential Unit citations. Along with the well-known 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion is recognized as one of the most decorated units for its size and length of service. This is especially remarkable when you consider that most mainland Japanese had lost all their property and were being imprisoned in internment camps in the California desert and elsewhere from the country from February 1942 on. Fortunately for the family of Ross, Hawaiian authorities fought the internment order and prevented Japanese American citizens of Hawaii from being imprisoned. However, after Pearl Harbor, the War Department took steps to discharge all Japanese Americans from the military. Their fear was that they would refuse to fight, or worse, that they would join forces with the Japanese enemy. Also, these Japanese Americans who had formerly served with the National Guard had their draft classification redone to 4C, which meant enemy alien. The Territorial Guard was disbanded. This event, and rightly so, was taken as a great insult by these loyal citizens who had signed up for the Guard. They refused to be denied the opportunity to serve their country. We, the undersigned, were members of the Hawaiian Territorial Guard until its recent inactivation. We joined the Guard voluntarily with the hope that this was one way to serve our country in her time of need. Needless to say, we were deeply disappointed when we were told our services in the Guard were no longer needed. Hawaii is our home, the United States our country. We wish to do our part as loyal Americans in every way possible, and we hereby offer ourselves for whatever service you may see fit to use us. Ross was born in August of 1918 and enlisted in the Army September of 1942. He had 3 years of high school and was working as a carpenter when he enlisted. He was married to Mildred, and they had 1 infant son, Cedric. Amid the drama, discrimination, and uncertainty, Ross stayed loyal to his country and his unit. The training for the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was particularly lengthy, continuing on until 1943. His unit finally shipped out from the U.S. to Italy in May 1944. They fought their way up the Italian peninsula in such bloody battles as Anzio and Monte Cassino. The 100th took such high casualties during this time that they became known as the Purple Heart Battalion. Ross received a battlefield promotion to 2nd lieutenant for bravery in combat on July 3rd, 1944. The exact circumstances are unknown, since his file, along with millions of others, were destroyed in the 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records in St. Louis. But in a grainy photograph from an Australian newspaper, Ross is pictured shaking hands with the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, James V. Forrestal. Right behind is Lieutenant General Mark Clark, who was in command of the Allies in Italy in World War II. The photo was captioned, "U.S. officer from Hawaii congratulated," citing some of the numerous awards awarded to members of his unit. At the end of the war, when the 442nd, including the 100th Battalion, returned stateside in 1946, they were honored by President Truman at the White House. Truman told them, "You not only fought the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won." Sadly, Ross was not among those to return. Somewhere in the chaos of a heavy German artillery barrage in the Vosges Mountains of France, October 19th, 1944, Ross was hit and killed by shell fragments to the head. Hours later, other soldiers from his unit located his remains. His personal effects were sorted out, and they were sparse and typical for an infantryman. All he had with him was a leather wallet, 2 bracelets, 1 pen and pencil set, and 57 snapshot photos. Following the death of soldiers, though, the Army did not discriminate when it came to the lengths it went to honor the wishes of the families of the fallen. Ross was buried 2 days after his death at the U.S. military cemetery at Epinal, France. In July 1947, the Army wrote to Ross's widow, Mildred, asking where she wanted her husband's remains interred. However, by then, 3 years after the war, Mildred had remarried, so she no longer qualified as next of kin. The Army turned to the American Red Cross, which often assisted them in tracking down the next of kin. The Red Cross turned to Ross's brother to make decisions about Ross's final resting place. However, since by law, a father is next in line, Ross's brother was not eligible to make the decision. Since further complicating matters is that Ross's father, Sanjayman, had moved back to his native Japan, leaving no forwarding address. Finally, in April of 1949, Sanjayman was located in a remote prefecture on the northeast side of the island of Honshu. Since he spoke no English, he required assistance to complete the Army's forms directing Ross's final burial place. After signing his name in Japanese characters, he directed his son's remains to be cremated and laid to rest in a cemetery near his home. Again, there's much more to this story, but in the end, the Army shipped Ross's cremated remains halfway around the world, from France to the United States, to the Philippines, and then to Japan. By my estimate, 23,000 miles, all at government expense. The administrative efforts in locating the proper next of kin and communicating with a father who spoke no English, and one who was living in a country with whom we had just fought the very war that took his son's life, was incredible. The communication between the officials and the family were always respectful and patient. And today, Ross rests in the cemetery at Oshimagun in the Yamaguchi prefecture. And despite the grave prejudice that played out against loyal Japanese Americans during the war, the Japanese troops fought with extreme bravery and helped to win the war. I want to thank you for your time and attention, for being here today to listen to some of these stories of how the heroes came home. The War Dead Return Project is an instance when we can be proud of our country for doing something truly extraordinary. Thank you for taking time out and being here. You can honor these men by knowing them, their names, and remembering them. I'd also like to thank John Lawn and the National D-Day Memorial for this event and for inviting me to speak. Thank you for all you do to continually help us remember and honor these heroes. If you'd like to learn more about the U.S. War Dead Repatriation Program, I understand that the D-Day Museum has copies for sale in the gift shop. You can also visit my website at www.research.com to purchase both signed and unsigned copies, and my book is also on Amazon as well. If we have time, I would love to answer some questions.
Thank you, Bill. That is fascinating and heart-rending and very important history that a lot of people don't realize. And if you don't mind, I'll point out it's still an ongoing process.
Absolutely true.
About 2 weeks from today, or I guess a week from Saturday, technically, a World War II airman named PFC Edward Benson who was killed March 22nd, 1945, on Biak in the Pacific, will be buried just a few miles from here in Roanoke, Virginia.
That's a great story.
Yeah, so it's still an ongoing process. DNA evidence has opened up a lot more opportunity to identify what were previously unidentified remains, and yeah, to me it's just fascinating, and as I say, also very often heartrending. We got a few questions have come in. One from Janine, who said, "Thank you so much for sharing my grandfather's story and keeping his memory alive." But,
Thanks, Janine. You're welcome.
I'm not sure which
She
story that
the
is.
Granddaughter. Janine is the granddaughter of Ross Fujitani.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah,
Well, thank you
and
for watching.
I wanted to add a quick story.
Absolutely.
Regarding these that were brought home, John. Of course, there was no DNA testing then, so the Army did most of their work by dental records. And so I'll tell you a quick story. A man was shot down over Hungary, 1944, and the military was trying to identify him, and so they went looking for his dental records. But the records had been lost, so they wrote a letter to his mother saying, "Can you put us in touch with his civilian dentist to see if the dentist has records?" Well, they found the dentist, but he had retired and all his records were gone. So the Army didn't quit. They wrote back to his mother saying, "Do you have a photograph of him that we can use?" And she sent them one of those photographs from those little booths that you would go in and pay 25 cents and get a little photo from. And so in the file, we have this great photo of this young man smiling at the top of the world. And anyway, they never were able to identify him after all that work.
Oh, goodness, but brave in the attempt.
Oh yeah, the attempt went on for a couple of years.
Let me. We got a couple more questions come in. But let me ask you one. What is an IDPF?
So an IDPF stands for Individual Deceased Personnel File. And in World War II, the U.S. military prepared an IDPF for all the 407,000 men and women that died. The original intent, John, was first to be able to say where they died, how they died, so that the next of kin might know. But also they wanted to know where the remains were buried so that after the war, they would be prepared to send them home. And I can tell you that there are IDPFs that are 5 pages long, and there are IDPFs that are 200, 300 pages long. So that's what an IDPF is.
And I wanted you to address that because often we get people asking about records such as that.
Sure.
And the other thing is they can be so heartrending.
They really are. I've got about 200 IDPFs for men that died at D-Day so far.
And very often, as the example you quoted, the mothers who just could not accept the death of a son, and it's hard to read that without choking up a little bit.
Very true. And I've done some files where mom and dad were stating that they still didn't believe their son was dead, even into the early 1960s.
Another question's come in. Did the government cover all the costs of sending the repatriated Americans home?
The government's covered all the costs, all the shipping, everything. And in fact, they also gave a $75 burial allowance to those who were burying their next of kin stateside. And of course, that sounds like a fractional number in today's world, but that would actually cover most. So yes, all the costs were borne by the U.S. government.
Excellent. And I've often seen in IDPFs, invoices from funeral homes.
That's right. Yeah, from funeral homes. And in my book, I've got a whole chapter on how the funeral homes dealt with this deluge of guys coming back home.
Excellent. Another one, April says, "Thank you for sharing these stories. Extremely moving and so important to remember. Approximately what percentage of World War II war dead were returned to the United States?"
2/3, almost exactly 66% were returned after the war.
Excellent. We, of course, often tell the story of the Bedford Boys here at the National D-Day.
Of course.
20 men from Bedford who were killed on D-Day itself, and I think 8 of them lie in a cemetery not far from where I'm sitting. Rest are either missing or in the Normandy American Cemetery.
Right.
And one very telling case of that is family of the 2 Hoback brothers. One both killed on D-Day. One never recovered, or if he was not identified. And the family decided to leave the other brother in France so he could be with us, with his other lost brother.
Very interesting.
Mitchell asked, were there any instances you ever came across where parents were correct and the children weren't dead?
I have never come across that. There are a few names listed on the World War II list of World War II dead that actually did survive, but I've never come across a case where the Army was wrong that way. I have done a few where they misidentified somebody, but they always went back and they eventually corrected it.
Right, and they were very exacting in it, as much as they could be.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some photos of the labs that these guys worked in, and they're very well supplied and stocked. And I'll add, John, that the Return of the Dead program cost $150 million. And so in the list of World War II expenses by the US government, the atomic bomb was the most expensive. Building the B-29 bomber was the second most expensive, and bringing the World War II dead was the third most expensive project that the U.S. did in World War II.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. And still an American tradition, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah, they still bring them back to Dover in Delaware. Yeah, absolutely true.
So, excellent. Well, no more questions have come in, but if you come up with one later on or you're watching this after the fact, feel free to email the D-Day Memorial or Bill at his webpage. And say, Bill, I could vouch, he does excellent research. So if you're ever looking for some answers about a World War II relative who, especially one that did not come home, so he's a great resource for you to check out. But Bill, thank you. This has been wonderful, and I say a great story. And next time you're walking through a cemetery, you see a gravestone of a man who died during the war. You will have better information how he got there and what a priority the American military made it to bring them home.
And John, just one note there. I've been contacted by dozens of people over the years who did just that. They were walking in a cemetery, they saw somebody, they didn't even know who it was, and they asked me to research him. So we need to look at those guys and remember them.
Each one a hero. And we owe them so much as we get ready for Memorial Day coming up, just to keep them in mind and their families left behind as well. So, Bill, we'll let you go, and thank you again. I hope you'll come to Virginia and see us soon.
Of course.
And for the viewers, thank you for joining us, and I hope we will see you soon for Memorial Day and June 6th commemorations. So thanks from the National D-Day Memorial. I'm John, and we appreciate you joining us.